Good morning, everyone. This is May the 26th, and this is our Genie seminar. And welcome. We again remind everyone that this is being recorded, and by participating, you are giving your permission. This will be available if individuals would like to review this in the public arena, because we're hoping that we will spread these kinds of meetings, these kinds of Genie seminars, which we think is a new, very exciting method of adult education that can continue through life. So if we are successful, we'll have other people listening to seminars and joining seminars. And hopefully we'll be spreading a newer way of education where people learn a newer way of thinking, Einstein's solution, Einstein's view that if we can teach ourselves a newer way of thinking where people learn to cooperate for mutual benefits, to share their energy for the benefit of all, instead of competing to attempt to dominate, if we can do that, then that was Einstein's solution to create a sustainable world peace and prevent what he predicted would be the eventual pushing of a button that would unleash weapons with the ultimate destructive power. So that's an introduction. And I'd like to pick up one thread, the thread that we had from our last week. And I asked if everyone who's not speaking, if you are muted, then we just had a little bit of noise coming in, but that will happen, of course. It doesn't take much moving your chair or whatever. So just, how to unmute yourself when you're ready to speak. So last week we had a thread where we introduced the idea that was promoted by two esoteric philosophers, George Gurdjieff and Peter Ouspensky. And if you recall, they had gave this kind of example of sheep who were raised by a master who was basically feeding them and fattening them up for his dinner table. But he was sort of a magician. He was able to convince the sheep that they were really being protected by this benevolent master. And he gave them protection. He fed them, and when it came time for them to be slaughtered, he was effective in sort of hypnotizing them or some auto-suggestion to convince them that this was one of the most pleasant and enjoyable things that they would be able to do, to sacrifice themselves. And of course, that's not much different than we think of a suicide bomber today, isn't it? The idea that people are convinced. One of the most basic urges we have is survival, and yet people seem to be relatively easily convinced that if they do something to essentially to murder themselves in the interest of a better life hereafter, that's a very positive thing to do. So that was our discussion. We had brought that up and raised the question, can we relate that to the way we think at times? Are we sort of asleep? I think part of the message of these two philosophers was that we are all in a state of basically unconsciousness. And we've talked about other leaders, such as Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was pioneering the idea of evolution, the new story of us. And the new story of us, basically, I think Barbara's idea was that and others, was that we, when we become consciously aware of who we are and what we are doing in our life situation, we have the ability to assume responsibility for our life's experience, that we control who we are, and we're not simply kind of mechanical items who are mainly here to procreate and see that there is survival of our species, sort of that automatic way of doing things, and that if we have conscious awareness, of who we are, that, and who are we according to the new idea. We're not simply brought here to reproduce and to survive. That may be the first steps, but that we have some other mission here, and that our mission has to do more with elevating ourselves to higher levels of moral, spiritual activity, where we engage in love and happiness. We've said the four qualities that we think are important are help, happiness, enough, love, and peace, rather than what we seem to be more involved in is we seem to be more involved at this point of fear, scarcity, hate, and war. That seems to be characteristic of what's going on. So, and then we introduced as part of our thread the story of the Hawaiian incident in January of 2018, where the false alarm went off for 38 minutes. And as we recall, at that time, the common behavior was that people were basically praying. They were bargaining at that time. They were bargaining with God to say, I will give up everything, my wealth, whatever, but save my loved ones, protect them. And second thing they were doing, which they were calling their loved ones, saying goodbye. And they were doing some other things like what was described, putting children down sewers or parking their cars under bridges or getting on the highway and driving as fast as they could, things that may not do resolve the issue. But the question then we raise to you is, how would you respond in that situation? Think about it. I asked you now, what would you do in that situation? Maybe someone would like to comment on that. How would you feel? What would you do if the alarm went off and it said, this is, and it was repeated for over and over, this is not a false alarm. The bombs are on the way, and do what you can do to protect yourself or what you feel you need to do. What would be your response? Would you have a response? Would you do what the people in Hawaii seem to do?
I don't think I would do what the people in Hawaii did. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know. My first reaction would be disbelief.
Interesting.
Which is the human spirit. You just don't want to believe that this is happening. And it would be fear. It would be terror. And probably an attempt to communicate with loved ones. But I don't know beyond that.
Any other thoughts?
I think just at some point, just becoming at peace with yourself. I mean, just saying that this might be the inevitability, and enjoying where you're at and the sun shining in your face and the birds chirping.
Might get a bottle of whiskey.
I don't know that I get a bottle of whiskey.
Well, I've often said that I would make a pitcher of martinis and go up on my roof and watch, because it would be quite a show.
Well, that might, when you think about it, maybe that would be the most relaxing thing you could do at that moment, as opposed to panic. If you had a choice of panic and being miserable, maybe something like that would be more sort of suitable.
I think you'd see a lot of people who have not reattached themselves with their given religious principles move very quickly to reestablish them in their own minds and pray fiercely.
Well, it's interesting to think about. So the question I'm really raising today is why is it that, as soon as the alarm was told to be false, people immediately stopped whatever that behavior was, and they went back to the more usual behaviors, began to think, and what would they be thinking about? What would you be thinking about in your daily life? And I think most would be thinking about making money, that is, being wealthy. Been thinking about maybe paying bills or a hairdresser appointment or the sports event or movie or whatever, but certainly things that were the ordinary things we think about that usually bring pleasure for here and now. That is what the way that we've basically been brought up to think about how do we deal with things. So the question I'm raising is why is it that we, even though our most knowledgeable people are telling us that it's usually people like Einstein, the United Nations, Committee on Nuclear Weapons, the Bulletin of a Nuclear Scientist, of Atomic Scientists who have created the Doomsday Clock, most of our people, the people who are involved in the Manhattan Project, and many of our scientists and knowledgeable citizens basically say that they are aware that this is one of our greatest dangers. It is our most immediate danger, but yet we put it off and we think that we don't pay much attention to it, and we do other things. So that's what I'm asking us to really consider today. Why do we have this kind of pattern of behavior? And what I'd like to introduce you to is an explanation. And I'll try to do this very quickly because I want to get your thoughts about it. But the bottom line, I think, is that if we understand our new story of evolution, our new story tells us that we have been pre-programmed over our billions of years of history to think in a way that the way that we inherit when we're born is that what we are pre-programmed in our animal or subhuman brain. We're born with an animal brain or a subhuman brain that has been pre-wired over billions of years, and certainly our cortex is probably 1 billion years old, but our brain goes back long before that, our earlier brains. We've been pre-wired to have the basic assumption, what's good for me for here and now, for today. Our ancestors, animal ancestors and earlier, did not have language. All they could process information was into either or categories, right or wrong, good or bad, us or them. And the way we had to solve disputes, especially when there was inadequate food, we didn't have enough resources, was by physical confrontation, what we call war. And those groups that had the largest numbers or the greatest power usually won the war, and their values and their people, plus other people the other tribes who may be converted, either became extinct or converted to their way of thinking, that became the new norm. So, as was said, crises such as war are the driver of evolution. Wars have been the reason we have had evolution. When we develop more powerful weapons, we win, and then evolution goes on to the next society. So our history, our historians describe our past by a series of wars. And wars have been very useful. They end disputes. They bring about peace. Wars are the cause of peace. That sounds like an oxymoron, but wars are the cause of peace. And peace lasts for a while until the next tribe gets more power, more better weapons. So we've then developed through our evolution, and evolution tells us that somewhere along the line, our species became divided into 2 different categories: masculine energy and feminine energy. We were no longer bisexual, that is both sexes in one organism. We were unisexual. And masculine energy received, what did masculine energy receive? Received muscles and the ability to make millions of sperm a day, seed, and the desire to become powerful, the love of power. And what did women receive? Women received the ability to nurture offspring, the ability to procreate. They were essentially given the means to create milk and nurture and offspring to maturity, and also to attract male seed. They had to be attractive. For example, we know that the female attracts the male, particularly if we look at earlier species like the dog goes into heat or estrus, and whatever is secreted in flowers and so on that attracts the bees. So the female was given beauty, and then what happened? In history, if we try to be honest, males usurped their muscular power to dominate women. So in our most primitive state, what happens? Our history is really not history, it is his story. Most of our story is the story of wars and the stories that males have created. And in the most primitive situations, we see what happens. Males will sew up the labia of females, remove their clitoris, punish them by death or murder for rules which men make. And of course, that's the most primitive situation. So we've created a situation where we have a world which is basically dominated by masculine energy, and where feminine energy, love and procreation, is suppressed. So the bottom line is that when we finally developed the ability to have a cortex and to develop symbols, when we developed symbols, we created words. And what are the words we created? We created words that were tribal words, that say, the words that have to do with patriotic words, religious words, political words, that essentially say, my way is the right way. So we've developed a way of thinking that divides the world into us and them, and our language causes us to be sort of unconscious to the idea or addicted to this way of thinking. So here's the bottom line as I'm presenting it to you. The reason we have wars, the reason we have the difficulty, is because our language has been created by our animal brain, and we have this addiction which we're not aware of, that leads us to divide the world into us and them, good or bad, and what's good for me and my tribe for here and now. And the message that Einstein has given us is that until we can create new words and new language, that allows us to think of both and instead of either or. Unless we can develop a simple new language or new words, which we have not yet done, we're still stuck with our language that were brought on by our ancestors, that we're all taught, that we're addicted to. That as long as we maintain this language, it'll only be a matter of time before we continue to pursue a kind of government, of self-government, where there are winners and losers, until eventually we create these more powerful weapons and someone uses them, and that'll be the end of things. So the message is, and this is I'm hoping to offer this as the greatest insight that I've come up with, is that until we develop a new language, new words, then we will continue to follow the same path we have. And that is why in our meetings here, if you know, we started with 7 word switches. That those 7 word switches are the words that enable us to change our way of thinking. And for the most part, we haven't taken them very seriously. But if we take them very seriously, it will change the way we think to a new way of thinking. But I'd like you to consider, are we the people, are we sheeples? I think that was the word Josephine introduced, that are we sheeples? Where we like those sheep, that we're very happy as long as we're given enough to feed ourselves and to be happy, and so on. We engage in basically placebos. We do what gives us short-term pleasure at the cost of long-term pain.
I'd like to go off in a little bit of another direction. with the first thing that was offered about what would you do if you got the word. That
That's
something
very
was.
good timing because I'm finished here.
I'm sorry. What did you say?
I said that's very good timing because I've completed what I wanted to introduce.
Okay. But one of the things I thought of, if I got this message, it probably wouldn't do it. I'd probably be panicked. But I was thinking of a bottle of champagne that somebody got us that's been sitting in our liquor cabinet for probably 25 or 30 years. And maybe it was time to open it up and use it, not put it off any longer. And I don't even particularly like champagne, but the idea that you put things off, thinking that someday there'll be an appropriate time. And I think the idea of not putting things off, things that you want to do, that you plan to do, do it. Not wait, not wait until somebody drops the bomb and the bottle gets broken in your liquor cabinet and nobody enjoys it. So I think that maybe not wait for the bomb, or not wait for an emergency, but to create and do things that you want to do, that you have somewhere, somewhere in your mind. You said, well, I'm going to do it one day, and make that someday soon. And that gets truer as you get older as well.
I'm sorry I had to mute Pacey because the noise is coming through.
I think part of this challenge, I think Mom was referring to, was, there's a tension or, debate, what do you do to enjoy today versus what do you invest in for tomorrow, which is, I think, what a lot of this is about. And that's sort of an age-old struggle of, for, those on one extreme, that if you do everything for the future and, the future comes and you realize you really haven't enjoyed the path along the way, that's not particularly good. And, the other side is if you forget about the future and do everything today, and you end up freezing because you don't have a place to live in the winter time because you didn't, put enough money away to actually to rent a house, that's not good. And usually it's that struggle between, well, how do you balance, how do you maintain the balancing act? So you can, keep yourself in a comfortable position or a survival position in the future, yet at the same time, you kind of enjoy what's going on at the moment. And that's, I think you can, at best, you can rebalance that. I don't think there's an automatic answer. I think that's a question that's the human condition to constantly be answered. I think your question, Dad, or your proposition is maybe you got to spend more time thinking about the future part. I don't think there's a solution where you say it's all in the future.
Had a conversation along these lines just the other day with a friend, and we were talking about, I was commenting that every single day I see people grappling with illnesses, terminal and otherwise, and dying, and they're much younger than me. And we're talking about, well, look at Social Security and look at money and all the rest of it, and retirement funds. Why don't you just take the money and enjoy life now, because you just don't know. And I understand the question, but my response to it generally is because I need to function and believe that there is going to be tomorrow and there is going to be a future, and that's the nature, again, not to be redundant here, of the human spirit. And I think to believe that I've got to go and liquidate retirement funds and go and buy, a Mercedes and take a trip around the world is not, it goes against my pragmatic nature. Am I too pragmatic for my own good? I don't know the answer to that. I truly hope what I've just said is rhetorical.
think that's the balance. I think that is the balance.
I have to endorse what Don said a moment ago. It is a balancing act. And I think that one of our serious problems here in what we're trying to do is we are, in fact, racing against time. And the equation is not a good one for what we're trying to do. Because in one breath, we're saying that ultimate destruction, given the loggerheads the world is at, could happen at any given moment. And yet we have to change centuries of thinking and introduce a concept to most people that is so completely remote that they're either in denial about it, dismiss it, or don't understand it. And we don't really have the time that it takes to create the new way of thinking in a more generous world. That's what we're up against, to me, which doesn't mean throw in the towel and give up. It just means identifying what the real conflict is in what we're trying to do.
I think I had to dial in because my computer is unstable when sometimes. Anywho, I think based on your intro, Don, people seem to react to urgency, right? And it could be urgency at either side of the spectrum. It doesn't only have to be urgency of something, horrible or impending, but people react and change, based on some immediate reason to change. Fall in love with this person, they're going to make you happy for the rest of your life, right? Oh, that's great. So you change, right? Or the world's going to end. Right now, the bomb's going to drop. You freeze or you change or whatever. You wish you'd planned before, but you didn't, so now you're screwed. So, what do we, if we're trying to get people to change and change quickly or quicker, or at least entertain the notion of changing their way of thinking, what becomes a message that they're going to resonate to? And if they're not resonating to something longer, term down the road because they have no sense of future or sense of hope, maybe the message needs to switch a bit so that it's providing a sense of hope. They're not going to react to a sense of doom that could potentially happen, years in the future. They're not responding to the climate news, and that could happen in 10 years in the future. And that's maybe much more immediate than some of this thinking. But I think the message needs to change in a way that it's hopeful. Maybe that's what, it's the gratification. It's immediate gratification. It's, I think there's a dearth of hope right now in the world. The science is proving it out, especially among the younger generation. So I think that's what we need to think about. How do we make this a more hopeful message?
I think along those same lines, it's a matter of what you can actually do. I think there's a sense of, if you tell somebody, there's very powerful leaders that might push the trigger and, what are you going to do to stop them? There's not a lot that somebody can figure out they're going to do to stop something like that. But if you say, what can I do to improve my own lot and happiness? That's something, if I take some action, I'm pretty sure I get some immediate benefit from it. And I think that sort of comports with the idea that, I'm doing things that I think I can affect or have some sort of effect on. And I can kind of see some immediate feedback from it. So I think that sort of short-term planning that's in the realm of what I can control and I see some direct benefit from, that sells a lot better than, the world is going to come to an end unless you take some action. And then you kind of think of what that action is and kind of think, well, I'm just, it's hard to be convinced that that action is going to make a significant difference. So think local, not global. So you can kind of you can convince more people along the local frame of reference as opposed to a global frame of reference. And if the local extends to the global, that's an organic bubble up from the bottom approach.
Yeah, I agree with that. I and I was thinking in terms of Josephine's thing with sheeples and that the analogy that Dad made. It seems to me that I think the analogy is good, with the exception of the fact that there's some greater deity who's doing this to these sheep, who's raising these sheep. I think the analogy fits better if we recognize that we're doing this to ourselves. It's not that there is some, and maybe this is a God or religion discussion, but I don't think there is some all-powerful thing that's guiding us towards this, what looks like a not good outcome, but we're doing it to ourselves. The sheep are doing it to themselves, and it becomes a different, when the sheep take responsibility for what they're doing to themselves, heading towards their own demise. It's more difficult to grapple with because there's not a bad actor who's doing it to them, and just the way there's not a bad actor who's doing it to us, we're doing it to ourselves. And that resonates to me with, in terms of what Abhi said about thinking locally and not globally, is that if you accept the assumption that we've done this to ourselves, then the have-nots, we are the haves, but the have-nots, there's a lot of redistribution that has to go on. There's a lot of changes that have to be made locally, which I think has to do with the sense that we've talked about enough. So I think when Abhi talks about what can we do locally, I think, well, for me, broadcasting that I have enough, and that and that message goes to other people that they can have enough, not at someone else's expense or because they conquer or dominate someone else, but if they behave in the way that I try to behave, then they may achieve that same sense of enough or peace. And I know locally one way I do that is the small business that I run, this medical practice. I pay people well. I give people a lot of freedom. I try to make it not what I see as some having the negative corporate, top-down boss things, and not looking at every dollar, and trying to make the experience and the way people are treated favorable, so it benefits everybody. I'm soon to bring on another partner in the medical practice, and providing that person a lot of assistance as they come on, the same that I did when I brought on this first partner, has been the first real tangible episode of me seeing how this works. The person who I started with, nurse practitioner, needed a lot of support, more than would be probably financially viable if I laid it out to anybody else. But has worked out very well because she's now really comfortable and feels like she does have enough and is more secure in what she's doing. And in the long run, it's going to serve me and her much better that she got to a place where she's comfortable and, supports the practice and pays some overhead that I don't have to pay. So I think that this is a long-winded way of saying this, act locally, I think does trickle down to, making small pockets of people who also feel like they have enough and they're satisfied. I don't know that we, in our own power, in our lifetime, can right all the inequities that have got us to this place, to all this pent-up energy that's hurtling us towards self-destruction. But I do think acting locally, I think that may be the beginning. Too rambling. So some of it boils down to just be nice.
Now I'm just trying to figure out how I can take advantage of that good nature of my brother. That too is the human condition.
That's it in a nutshell. The human condition is what's good for me and myself my family for here and now. That's the point. That's our condition. And we don't realize that. Until we can change that to what's good for you and me, my tribe and your tribe for now and the future. But we're not aware, we're not consciously aware of this. We've been born with billions of years of past history of being pre-programmed and pre-wired to think what's good for me for now and the future. And when we finally did develop the ability to use language, we developed a language that supports the old way of thinking. What's good for me for here and now? What do I need, for example, to have more powerful weapons? It's the masculine energy dominating. What do I need to have more powerful weapons so I can dominate and be superior in win-lose confrontation? And we've lost the idea, the other part of the equation, the love part, the working with others, what's good for now and the future, for the progeny. It's not just a matter of dropping the seed and leaving. You know, the female is required to spend time, the 9 months and then years afterwards, to nourish that child. And that's why the female has a different perspective of looking at things that has to do with now and the future. Very different than what we've learned. So we've come to this point of comfort. It's the sheep is comfortable as long as he's getting fed, as long as he's getting taken care of and protected. You know, he's keeping the wolves away. The master is keeping the wolves. He's perfectly happy. And then he's convinced that it's okay because you'll be happy when I eat you. No, I can give you a way of thinking that you're going to believe that what's good in the hereafter is you're going to be rewarded later. So until we can change that way of thinking, then we don't want to get out of our comfort zone. I think that's part of the issue. Now, here's what's different, you see. In the new language, what happens differently is if we have an accurate history, if we have an accurate history of what happened from past to present, we have a trajectory that we can project into the future. If we know what happened from before to now, we can predict the future with a high degree of accuracy. And as long as we tell ourselves stories that we've been telling ourselves, that God is a benevolent person who will take care of us if we pray and just obey the laws of the authorities, instead of what I think, actually what you brought up yourself, Pacey, that when we realize that, and this is what the story of evolution, this was Barbara Marx Hubbard's, I think, brilliance. She was saying what Darwin told us and what the new story tells us, a more accurate story of past to present, instead of that we were created in one day with all the other life 6,000 years ago, that this is a gradual process, that when we have an understanding and awareness, a conscious awareness of our past to the future, and we can predict the future, we invent prevention. We can then prevent what we don't want to happen if we are consciously aware. So the message is that we are, and this is Einstein's message, we're asleep and we don't know it. We are consciously unaware that of the distance, we're more oriented to placebos. The way we've been thinking is basically we think in terms of placebos. What's good for today? What will work now? And we forget about the future. So we do what we do, we forget. It's not until we have the first heart attack until we make a change. It's not until it's not until the warning goes off that we say, now I'm ready to bargain. Now I'm ready to look at the situation and say, maybe it's not the money I have in the bank, because when that siren went off in Hawaii, nobody called their bank to see how much money they had. That wasn't the behavior.
Yeah.
It was very different.
Yeah, but that, can I comment that I think that, if you say the trajectory of the past forecasts the future, I mean, the other information that people bring to this is that if I drop my defenses, there will also be no future. The idea that we've got North Korea or some bad actors that are willing to, develop nuclear arsenals and throw them or hurl them, to gain their own influence. The idea they say, well, we'll just work with them. The past does inform us that maybe we do need those bombs, or we do need those defenses. If you look at the history of Gaddafi or the people who gave up the bombs, they're no longer in power right now. The idea that might makes right, it still is an operational condition of humanity. I think that balance kind of comes in, when you sort of say that the past informs the future. I think it does, and that's one of the reasons that there is some reluctance to sort of say, well, we just have to change everything. If somebody knew quite how to change something, it's not quite sure what you would do to mitigate that side of it. If we had no nuclear bombs, would the assumption be that there would definitely be somebody hurling nuclear bombs at us if it was completely clear that we weren't going to defend ourselves? So I think that part of the past does inform us, and it doesn't really inform us that we have to drop all of the hostility.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are two problems. I think Avi elucidated one. One is that we're not starting with a clean slate. We're starting with a lot of historical baggage and positioning and inequity that a great deal of humanity has interest in preserving. So the fact that we're not starting with a clean slate is problematic, and to pretend as if we are starting with a clean slate would be self-destructive, because I doubt everyone else is going to make that same jump at the same time. The second problem I see in adopting some of this is a lesson that comes from The Matrix, the movie, which is, Matrix talks about, humans who are basically asleep. They're being, controlled. And The Matrix is a movie about this small subset of heroes who want to try to liberate people and wake them up and realize they're living in a computer kind of virtual reality. And some of the people who are awakened choose to stay asleep. They have the choice, and they say, I don't want to wake up. I don't want to struggle for freedom. I want to be in the fantasy world where, I had a store and a wife and I was taken care of, and I felt good. So I think this a second hurdle that we have to get over is to recognize that some people would choose exactly what we have. They would choose to stay asleep, and it may be not even approaching someone cognitively or rationally or emotionally. They may not choose what we're trying to offer, and that's a problem that I think exists. I'm not sure what the way around that.
Well, do you see now the power of the word switches? Why when we substitute both and for either or, as long as we have this, it's either got to be this way or that way. That's the way our animal brain thinks. It's the way we think in terms of either or. But when we can come up with a new word switch like both and, when we realize maybe we do have to have arms now because there is already baggage. But we also have to teach that if we can cooperate with one another, that we can do both. It doesn't have to be either or. So unfortunately, the way the world works now is the people on either end of the spectrum are the ones that are arguing. The ones in the middle are sort of passively sitting by. So we have this confrontation here.
Yeah, one of the observations I got, Dad, is if I look what happened after World War II in the Marshall Plan, I mean, there was a very aggressive country, Germany, and I suspect Russia, Italy, that were interested in dominating the entire world. But when the Allies won, or the U.S. won, they didn't go over and just take over Japan or take over Western Europe, for that matter. They basically said that, well, we're going to try to support you and support your non-aggressive governments and build you up, and you continue to benefit, and we'll trade with you, and we'll coexist with you, but we're particularly interested in making you satellite countries. And it was, I think, tremendously successful. in the terms of the standard of living. So that was a case where it's not just a matter of, it's me or you. I think it was a recognition that, well, we'll do what's maybe consistent with our values. And we don't want to go back to war with you again, but we aren't necessarily interested in turning you into a satellite colony. And if you could, the way the plan, if you look at what Russia did, there's not a lot of Eastern Bloc countries anymore that are successful or want to stay in the Eastern Bloc, and the Western Bloc countries are relatively, prosperous. So there is some cases along where it's not just which dominate or I guess the masculine power. I don't know if you'd call it feminine power, but for whatever reason, the U.S. or the people left standing, weren't interested in just colonizing everybody and saying, all right, now that you're vanquished, now we'll tell you how to, we'll just create a satellite and you'll just live the way we tell you to live. So there is some precedent where people did actually work together and do things that were cooperative as opposed to just domineering.
I think that when you do good things for other people, sometimes it can be calculated, but the certain kinds of kindnesses pay off in the end, and we don't know where it's going to go. And it may seem local, but it may turn out to be global. I'm not sure if this is a true story or not, but I had heard that when Trump's father died, Kushner, Jared Kushner's father, showed up at the funeral, where a lot of people didn't. It was a snowstorm or something like that in New York, and this guy came to pay his respects, where a lot of people didn't, and it wasn't too convenient to pay respects, and that was one of the reasons he's been his attitude toward Israel is the way it is. Kushner was a big backer of Israel. So, it may be that kindness on Kushner's part influenced the course of the world. I'm not sure there are a lot of things, but you just don't know. You don't know if you do something nice for somebody when you could have done something not nice or not done something at all, where it's going to land and what impact it might have. So it's sort of it's a reason for taking the higher road rather than the lower road if you have a choice. And it makes you feel good. I'm sure that, when the appreciation that Trump showed when Kushner showed up made Kushner feel good. So that's sort of combining both but you don't know what are the important things and what are the not important things.
It sort of reinforces it's the process and not the end game. You kind of do what you can do consistent with your values and then hope it turns out, as opposed to doing everything with the.
Well, I mean, don't have to depend on that, but it can be a factor.
I was thinking that the sheep. I know, Dad. This seems like I'm always contradicting you. But I was thinking when I was growing up and had a job over at Albazi's farm, I think picking tomatoes or cucumbers, something up on Birch Mountain Road. I remember there was the father who was the farmer, and he had a bunch of cows, and those cows were eventually going to be slaughtered. And he would raise them, but he would look to them quite lovingly. He would go out and he'd pet them and pat them on the head, and he'd go and feed them. And I was thinking of your sheeple story, or the sheep herder, and the side of the benevolent dictator bad guy, that there really wasn't a bad guy. At least you'd say a bad guy because this guy ultimately is slaughtering the cows. But it wasn't just manipulation. He really, I mean, from looking from the outside in, he really loved these cows. I mean, he'd go pet them on the head, and he was quite affectionate towards them. And the cows, were, I don't know if it's affectionate, but they seemed to appreciate or were happy to see him, were happy to be fed. And ultimately, that system that they were living in was one where they were getting slaughtered ultimately. But there wasn't so much a bad guy and a good guy. There was just a system that was, inherited and moved through, and, was kind of an equilibrium and balance. And, those actors involved were all sort of at peace with it. And I think that a little bit of the momentum, that we say, that you can say that the climate is really kind of it's becoming more and more clear that it's a real issue. But, it takes a lot of work before you can break the equilibrium, which I guess is what you've been saying right along.
Well, if people's attitudes have been comfortable and fixed for either or thinking, right or wrong, then it's going to be rather hard to change that to this both end.
Well, I don't think people see things in all either or. I think that there's contemplation. There might be other ways to do it, and then on balance, the calculus is it's not important enough to change. I kind of think of the vegetarian issue that, if anybody saw, or most people can probably imagine what it's like in a slaughterhouse, yet most people are still meat eaters. They understand what the ramifications are, and it's really a decision not to make a change, just because of the comfort or the history or that's what the system is. I have to just decide whether to go on heart medication or not, or statin medication. And I in general, I don't like taking anything in my body that might affect it. On the other hand, I am a member of a civilization, and this is what this civilization is recommending for me. And I'm inclined to go ahead and move forward with it. Kind of at my gut level, I don't think it's a particularly good idea. I think there's a downside to it, but on one hand, it's like I'm not going to master all of the ins and outs of medical science. And at a certain point, I'm going to inherit or accept that is the society and culture I'm in, and I will probably defer to it. Everybody's recommending that except my brother.
Well, part of all that is how closely you examine anything. And I mean, if you think about it, it isn't just meat eating. It's, we all eat eggs, and I know where they come from. Sometimes that gives me pause. Doesn't stop me.
Yep. No, it doesn't stop me either. I mean, it's something I consider. It goes into the formula, but it isn't necessarily something that is going to drive me to a discrete change in action.
It doesn't have to do too with belief, right? It's kind of, what do you believe? Do you believe that eating meat is so horrible? Even if you know that the conditions under which animals are slaughtered are awful, you believe, probably that it's okay, it's your right, that's the way they're slaughtered, and meat tastes good, and I'm a human and they're an animal, so I eat it. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you don't believe, or anyone doesn't, if you don't believe that the world's going to end tomorrow, or that we have to worry about nuclear holocaust, nothing is going to change. The belief has to be such that there is, one, I believe I can make a difference, and two, that there is some kind of benefit in me making that change, and three, the reason why I'm changing, it's good. Either it's good for me and good for others, or it's just good for others, or it's good for society, whatever. It's a good change, right? Most people don't change to be worse. They change to be better. So I think it's how do you, what do you believe, and how do you get someone to believe your argument? How do you build a persuasive argument to change your belief system?
The assumptions that we make are what we act on. And I think the message from my perspective is that evolution is telling us that when we have an accurate understanding of who we are and our purpose, our intention, we're more likely than to be responsible for ourselves. That is, we are the creators of our life experience. When we have the ability to prevent what might happen in the future because we have a conscious awareness of where we're headed.
Dad, can you talk closer to the mic so you're more hearable?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can also turn up this volume a little, if that will help. Sure, okay, sorry about that. But when we're more consciously aware, then we're in a better position to be aware of the past to the present, and we can use, that's called the scientific method when we have knowledge. Knowledge is awareness of cause and effect, or what people have called the supreme law of orderliness and predictability. Einstein didn't believe in the God that most people think of. He believed there was some force that was orderly and predictable. There was an orderly universe we lived in. And if we could understand something about our past to the present, then we can use that information or that knowledge to accurately project into the future. We call that prevention. When we have the ability to use prevention, then we have the ability to control our lives. So your comment, Pacey, was that when we realize that maybe we are the ones that are responsible for our life situation, that it wasn't God who created nuclear weapons or pollution or poverty or whatever, that we have polluted the earth. We're creating these weapons. We're the ones who are biased and prejudiced. We're the ones who are deciding not to educate ourselves, or we're the ones who are deciding that certain people should have all the money and all the resources and other people can be slaves or whatever. So when we become awake that we are the ones that are creating much of our problems, that we are consciously aware of that. When we're aware that when we do certain things, we make it more likely that we're going to have a heart attack. Or we make it more likely that if we sit into the sun too long, we're going to get skin cancer. When we realize our potency, not that we're kind of dependent on others, which is the way we inherit. We inherit the idea that there's some creature out there who will take care of us. And as long as we pray and we bargain and do the right things and follow the orders. So instead of thinking in terms of right or wrong, the idea of it was a positive addiction. It wasn't a negative addiction that we got into wars. Our ancestors, it was natural that if they had more power, that they would survive because there weren't enough resources. Today, we have the ability to make enough corn and make enough water if we don't overpopulate the earth. So we have the ability to change things if we're willing to do something different. We have the ability to develop a synergistic state of government where people direct their product of their energy for the benefit of all, instead of a capitalistic system, which is a zero-sum game, where some people end up with all the wealth and others not. Now, I know this is going to stir up another reaction from you, Abby, because that's your job to be very oppositional. That's fine. I think that's very helpful. But until we can learn to think in a different way, and it's not that it was wrong to be involved with war. You see, that's the way we are automatically think, this either or way of thinking we don't realize we have. Years ago, it was perfectly appropriate and sane to want more weapons because that was the way we could survive, but there was no other way. Now that we have a language, we can develop words that allow us to cooperate and settle disputes by negotiation. The sheep might be able to talk to their master and say, look, you know, I can create wool for you. You don't have to eat me. You know, how about if I just give you wool? Won't that make you happy? Then you don't have to slaughter me. Then you don't have to take my children or whatever and make lamb chops out of them. But we can instead, let's negotiate a little bit. Let's see if we can use our sensibilities, common sense. But you see, the sheep don't have language. They don't have the ability to do that. And the language that we have is the language that was appropriate years ago. But in today's world, you know, we don't have to fight anymore and engage in war. You know, it's said that, you know, if we look at World War II, if we were to drop our arms, if the other countries were to drop their arms and say, okay, we'll do it your way, Germany or Italy, where would the world be? The word, you know, it would be Deutschland über alles. You know, that was the motto, Deutschland über alles, only German blood is right. And if, on the other hand, if Germany were to drop their arms, there would probably be peace. I don't think that England or the United States was going to say all the Germans are going to be slaves now to us. And we have the same situation in every other war situation. It said that if the Arabs were to drop their arms, it's unlikely that Israel was going to say, we want all of your country and your people and your children or whatever. There would be peace, probably. If the Israels were to drop their arms, it's pretty clear what would happen. That would be the end of Israel. And this is true of every other fundamentalist, wherever there's a fundamentalist way of belief, whether it's a religious belief. We did the same thing with when Christianity tried to take over the world and Muslims are over the world or whatever. So, and whatever other, I mean, our whole history is defined by this either way of thinking that we're not aware of. So these word switches, when we can begin to realize it's not either or, it's both and until we can become more consciously aware of our limitations, we're not going to make any change. But it's not so easy because, you know, once you're comfortable, once you're established with placebos, you do what feels good now. Yeah, I enjoy ice cream. I know it's not good for me when I have diabetes, but I still decide maybe I still want some of that ice cream, and I'm willing to give up a couple of days of my life. At the end of my life, I don't want to be totally austere that I'm going to give up something, but there might be some balance there. Maybe there's a bit of each, and unfortunately, as long as we are born and instinctively process information into us and them, either or, because biologically that's the way we've been programmed and we don't realize it. So it takes a little while to us, you know, it takes a lot of repetition before we're willing to drop down our arms, you know. When the robber comes and says, just drop down your arms and you don't have to defend yourself. To go from the point of this masculine energy, which is dominating, as opposed to the love part of it, it takes, you still have to have a big stick, as they say. You still have to have a little, what is it, a big stick and some sugar as well. So we need to bring back a little more unconditional love instead of tribal love, what's good for me and my family. And we're not there yet. But this group and the way that you all are thinking, from my point of view, to me, you are the most advanced people. I don't expect the solution is going to come from people who've been brought up from the time they were born to be deprived of education to be told that they're not valuable, they're what they do is kind of worthless. I'm not sure that you say that, you know, maybe the slave was treated very well, but I'm not sure they were particularly happy that their role was a slave. Maybe if they were taught that yes, slavery was pretty good because we're taking care of you, so you'll just be my servant the rest of your life. And maybe they would feel pretty good about it. And maybe when we first freed the slaves, when Lincoln came along and he said, "We'll free the slaves," and of course he had a lot of opposition. It took many years before there was a law passed that freed the slaves. So Lincoln was really quite a brave person to go against what everybody wanted or what our Constitution said. But when the slaves were freed, they weren't necessarily better off. The fact that they had no education, they had no jobs. So maybe they were better off in slavery. But if you look back at it and say, is it a good idea then that we should have slavery? Because some people like it, and other people would say, well, it's better than not having anything at all. So these are just some things to ponder, to think about. But I really believe that we are the ones who are going to make the change if there's ever going to be a change. But I think we're pretty well addicted ourselves. I know I am, and I'm trying to learn to be unaddicted and to be more consciously aware of some of these issues. But it's not so easy.
I would ask one question. When you said, initially it made sense to me, but now it doesn't. When you said war is the cause of peace, I think that I don't think that I agree with that. I think that war may come and go, but I think peace, the peace that we're talking about, is more than the absence of war. I think war, has created periods of war, periods of not war, and there's been kind of a sine wave over time where it comes and goes. But it may be on a future call worth discussing what peace really looks like besides the absence of war, because peace, at least kind of the utopian view of peace, is something that recapitulates itself. And I think right now, the pattern of history and the pattern of wars recapitulates that pattern. And we see where, the next upslope of the sine wave of war and peace, the war's going to be so bad, or the weapons are so bad that it's going to end the whole game. But I think it's worth exploring whether war really does lead to peace, or whether we need a better sense of what peace is, because I don't think we really have that. So for a future discussion.
I think that's a wonderful idea. It's a wonderful idea, but what I'm saying is war is a temporary cause of peace, not necessarily the absolute cause, but when you have one group is overpowered and they submit for a period of time, you do have peace. But as long as people still have the same idea that they would like freedom, then there's always going to be another war that comes up. So I agree that it's wrong when we think that war is the opposite of war. Peace is a positive experience. I would think of peace as what's the word I'm trying to think of? It's a very positive experience. It's not the absence of something. Peace is it's the positive experience of joy and happiness and so on. It's not absence of something. So it's not the opposite, but it is. It's not the opposite. Just like hate is not the opposite of love. Hate is. If you think of the other side of the moon is the back side of something. Your back is not the opposite of your front. It's part of your front. It's attached to it. It's all related. It's all one thing, the front and your back. So when we think of the opposite of something, so whenever we love someone, we also develop an equal amount of hate where whoever is going to do something to hurt the person we love. So love and hate, every time we create love, we're creating an equal amount of hate. But we don't realize that. We think of hate as the opposite of love. But in some ways, we can understand that as long as we process information into good or bad, right or wrong, or us or them. But if we can change some of our words thinking, it's not either or, it's both and.
I realize I'm not, I don't know if I believe that when you create love, you also create hate. But I'm just, in responding to the war is the cause of peace, I think it's worth recognizing that war might cause the cessation of war at the end of war, but it doesn't lead to peace. That peace is something different than the absence of war, and that in our search for peace, if this really is a search for world peace, it might mean, exploring what is that notion. If peace, if we haven't achieved it yet, if peace is not the absence of war, then that's a prerequisite of peace. But I think in the future, it might be worth clarifying, what do we really mean by peace that recapitulates itself? Because war does not lead to that thing. War leads to the absence of war and then a future war.
I think that's a wonderful idea that we ought to talk more about it. The word I was looking for was blissful. It's not the absent, peace isn't the absence, no, it is blissful. It's a very positive experience, blissful experience. So we have not heard from a few people. Anyone else like to comment before we end our meeting? Katie, would you like to have a few words here? We need your wisdom, Katie.
Man, I'm not quite sure how to obitize it, Obitize is kind of one of the words that I think of now, putting that spin on things. But, he has I would be going off there. When Pacey said he had an objection to your, when you were talking about that war is the driver of evolution and that we wouldn't have had evolution without the war, well, that's internal, that's totally false. It's simply been the reality we've known. And I think I'm hoping one of the words that gets adopted soon is co-opetition rather than competition. Because I know the arguments about competition and how it's healthy and it does make us be. And, I'm I see this ninja warrior, and at first I was repelled by something like the ninja warrior. Oh, Marilyn's giving me, you're not hearing me good. But now I see that so many children are really becoming more physically fit because of this. So maybe it's not such a bad thing. One of the points I think we need to look at is how our history has been, it's been hijacked. That's a lot of accurate history. So a lot of your premise on is based on the fact that if we do have an accurate history, and for the most part, it's been written by the victors and it's not accurate at all. And so, and I think once you can, like for so long, I've been asking, what is the 100th monkey of consciousness? What's it going to take? Because I've been in calls, these weekly calls, I do so many. Now it's like you can say, I don't even care how I look anymore. But I started with Barbara so long ago, and Humanities Team, and then Michael Beckwith, and the Noetic Institute, and just all of these amazing powerhouse entities. And I'm asking, well, they tell me it's only 10% of the population that has to adopt anything before we have a new 100th monkey effect. And so I've kind of been, what is it going to take there? Because there is so many people working towards a good thing. And then I guess another point I think I want to make is once you establish, or maybe within your own mind, you realize that might is never going to make right. And money's never going to buy happiness. And so you start asking these questions beyond the norms of how we've been doing things, I don't know. I know we're getting late, and that's a lot of just kind of loose threads that wouldn't be wrapped up. I love the ideas of having more conversations about these drivers, about these peace, about what peace is, and about our word switches. The new AI is autonomous inspiration, brought to us by Pacey. And I'll return the talking feather and thank you all for listening. But I guess one other thing I want to make is I get my eggs from the Joy Farm, you know, so I know where my eggs come from. And I go out and I help with execution if I need chickens, you know. And so, and I love them. I love the critters. And so it is a weird place of things that you love and then you eat. But you have to look at it, it's kind of that slave test. They have a very good life. They have a really wonderful life and one bad day. So just the way it's okay here.
And if they didn't lay eggs, they would have no life. Isn't that true? If they didn't lay eggs, we would not create them.
Well, which came first?
Neither. The chicken and a little bit of chicken, a little bit. It was both then, it wasn't either or. But anyway,
No,
And the
it was
question
scrambled
of the
fried.
day,
It was the egg. They actually did a research. I think they've done the research now. It's the egg. But
actually,
I say
Brad, I
it's the
thought
chicken.
you had the press question of the day. Am I too pragmatic for my own good?
So I've always been that.
well, thank you for your wisdom. I knew you had something hidden back there. Pearl, would you like to comment? You haven't said anything.
How do you like your eggs?
I unmuted you, Pearl. Are you still with us? Okay, maybe Pearl isn't with us.
Yeah, I don't think Pearl's number is showing anymore.
It looks like I see it on my screen here.
It might be over here.
It's 4200.
Okay, so at any rate, does anyone have any final comments before we end our meeting?
Yeah, there she is.
Yeah.
We certainly have some things to think about, and we haven't solved the problem yet. But we're working on it, and I think if it is going to be solved, we're going to be the ones to do it. So it's not easy, but have patience. Patience is one of the important things, but I think we're making some really great headway here. So I think we're further along than anyone else that I know. You mentioned all these wonderful people, Katie, and they all have wonderful ideas, but to my understanding, no one has yet come up with a solution that will get us there. But I think we're getting close to it. We're working on it. And so we're on our way. So thank you all, and we're going to have our business meeting now. But unless anyone else had a final comment, we'll say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so